Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irishgrannyhelen and happy Thanksgiving. This is a special little bit of research that I did. I wanted to do some kind of true crime thing this week because it's very popular except for a few people, apparently. And this case, I didn't know who I was going to cover this week. And then this case presented itself. And we'll talk about that a little bit more after we get into the details. Just before I start, I just want to remind everybody, I'm not a detective. I'm not an investigator. I'm not going after all the minutia of the crimes that I cover. I'm presenting a story. This is just meant to be a distraction from the real world, a little bit of entertainment, just something to keep you busy, keep your mind off other things. I don't pretend that this is the full story. I don't pretend when I cover a true crime story that I have every single nuance, every single bit of detail. I'm not here to relitigate anything. I might make some statements about what I agree or disagree with, but those are just personal opinions. We're all entitled. So I'd appreciate it if you listen, if you're interested and you enjoy the story, a little intriguing mystery, and you don't have to agree. You don't have to disagree in 17 million comments. That's all I'll say. So, with that being said, here's a little Thanksgiving mystery for you. We're going to talk about the case of D.B. Cooper, or Dan Cooper. Nobody knows when he was born because nobody knows who he really was. But the person who identified himself as D.B. Cooper disappeared November 24th, 1971, 53 years ago. They just celebrated the 53rd anniversary of this crime. And it's an interesting synchronicity to me because the other day I was wondering, boy, who can I talk about that's not going to cause all sorts of controversy and get people all upset about the case and bring out every armchair detective in the country coming at me. That's not what I'm about. I'm just telling a story. Take it with a block of salt. And I really didn't know who I would do. And then I picked up the newspaper and read this article, which we're going to get to at the end. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. Weirdly coincidental, the date. And I actually planned to do this yesterday. Today is Thanksgiving. I planned to present this on the eve, the actual, well, not the date anniversary, but the concept anniversary. Because this crime was committed in 1971 on Thanksgiving Eve, which happened to be the 24th that year. It's a movable feast. So he's never been fully identified. Who is this character? But what did he do? He hijacked Flight 305, a Northwest Orient Airlines airplane, flying from Portland, Oregon on Thanksgiving Eve and heading to Seattle. It's supposed to be a 30-minute flight, roughly. And this is how the crime unfolded. He used cash and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, 30 minutes north. And this was scheduled to fly out of SeaTac Airport. And on the ticket, because times were different and you didn't have to provide a ton of information about yourself, on the ticket he wrote the name Dan Cooper. He was a white male in his mid-40s roughly, dark hair, brown eyes, wearing a dark suit, white shirt, a thin black tie, had a black raincoat, and brown slip-on shoes. He was carrying a briefcase and a paper bag that appeared quite full. He took seat 18E, the last row of the plane in the rear, and ordered 1 bourbon and 7. The crew consisted of 6 people: the captain, the first officer, the engineer, and 3, using terminology of the time, stewardesses, 3 young women who were flight attendants. There were 36 passengers, and they took off at 2:50 Pacific Standard Time, right on schedule. After takeoff, this man in the back seat handed a note to Florence Schaefer, a stewardess. She thought, oh, this is another businessman making the move on me. And she didn't even look at it. She just put it in her purse. So he had her come over and he whispered to her, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." So, yikes. The note was written with a felt tip pen. It was all capitals, and it said, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me." Okay. You don't get an offer like that every day. So she sat down next to him and gave him back the note and asked to see the bomb. He opened the briefcase. It had 2 rows of 4 red cylinders each, and they looked to her like dynamite, and there was a wire and a battery, so it looked very much to her amateur eyes as a bomb. He shut the case, and he told her his demands. So he dictated them, she wrote them down, and she took them to the flight crew. The captain, Captain Scott, told her, "You stay here in this cockpit and you start keeping a written chronology of all the things that are happening right now. I want you to, in real time, record the events." He then radioed Northwest Flight Operations in Minnesota. That's where Northwest was headquartered. And he said Cooper requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 o'clock. He also wants 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes, and wants the money in negotiable American currency. They thought in retrospect that it was really smart of him to ask for 4 parachutes, because by doing that, it implied he might be forcing people to jump with him, and therefore they could not sabotage the parachute they gave him, and take care of that problem, because who knew who would be using the parachute. Stewardess Tina Mucklow sat next to Cooper as a liaison with the crew. And he described how he wanted this to unfold. Land at SeaTac Airport, fuel up the plane. The passengers remained seated while Tina went out and got the money and brought it in. And once the money was in the plane and parachutes, then he would release the passengers. And the cockpit, they notified Seattle police and the FBI. The passengers were told that their arrival in Seattle was going to be delayed by minor mechanical difficulties, and they would just be flying in a circle. The president of Northwest Airlines authorized the ransom. This is where the money was coming from. And he told his employees to comply completely. So the plane circled Puget Sound for 2 hours while the money was collected and the parachutes were collected and emergency personnel were gotten ready on the ground. Tina later said that he seemed familiar with the local terrain. He would look out the window and comment, and he recognized what he was looking at. At one point, he looked down and said, "Well, that looks like Tacoma down there." He seemed to know where McCord Air Force Base was, because there was a discussion about getting the parachutes from them. She said he was not nervous. He was nice. He wasn't cruel or nasty. And so she asked him, why Northwest Airlines? And his answer was, it's not because I have a grudge against your airline. It's because I just have a grudge. And also he added that the flight particular schedule and area of the flight suited his needs. So he chatted about her home in Minneapolis. The headquarters were in Minneapolis, and that was where she was centered, and they talked about Minneapolis. He seemed familiar with it. She asked, "Where are you from?" And she said he got upset and he wouldn't answer. He offered her a cigarette, and she said, "Well, I quit," but she took one anyway. Allegedly, he talked to another passenger, and this is an undecided situation here. We never will know now at this point. A passenger called George La Bissonniere told the FBI that he made several trips back and forth to the bathroom. And on one, he said the aisle was blocked by a guy in a cowboy hat who was asking Tina about the mechanical problem. George saw Cooper sitting next to her, and he said at first this guy looked amused, and then he looked irritated, and then he told the guy in the cowboy hat to go sit down. And the cowboy ignored him and kept questioning Tina. George finally convinced the guy in the cowboy hat to go sit down. There's no real explanation or description of how he did it, but interestingly, Tina tells a different story. She said a guy came up to her and asked her for a sports magazine because he was bored. So she took the guy behind the last seat, behind Cooper, and looked through magazines. And the guy took the New Yorker and then went back to his seat. When Tina sat next to Cooper again, he said to her, if that guy's a sky marshal, I don't want any more of that. And she told him there aren't any sky marshals on this plane. The cowboy was never interviewed or ID'd by the FBI. So the Seattle First National Bank put a bag full of money together, $200,000. It weighed 19 pounds. It included 10,000 unmarked 20s with serial numbers starting with the letter L. And they were all insured by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. The Seattle police got 2 parachutes from a skydiving school and got 2 more from a stunt pilot. So I guess McChord Air Force Base was never involved. The plane landed at SeaTac Airport at 5:46 p.m. It parked away from the main terminal in a partially lit runway. They let the passengers out. He let the passengers out through the front door after the airline representative brought the money and the parachutes. First, Mucklow, the flight attendant, went out and met the airline courier and took the money and gave it to Cooper, walking past all the passengers with this bag of money. And you have to wonder what was going through their heads. And as the passengers got out of the plane, she asked Cooper, hey, could I have some of the money? And she's joking, and he handed her a packet of money, and she refused at that point and said gratuities are against company policy. He'd already tried to tip out of his own pocket earlier, tip the flight attendants, and they'd all refused. Then Tina went out and got the parachutes. Hancock, the other flight attendant, asked if the flight attendants could leave with the rest of the passengers, and Cooper said, whatever you girls would like. So Hancock and Schaefer left. Mucklow gave Cooper the parachutes and a set of printed instructions how to use them, but he said he didn't need the instructions. As the plane refueled, he opened one of the parachutes. He cut the parachute out of the bag and used it to put the money into. He was irritated. He'd asked for a knapsack with the money, and they hadn't given him a knapsack. They gave him this money bag. So he improvised. He was impatient. He gave the flight crew a plan to go southeast to Mexico City to fly at 3,000 feet and 100 knots, which was the minimum safe speed they could do. He told them to deploy their landing gear, to lower the wing flaps 15 degrees, and to keep the cabin unpressurized. He was told that this would require a stop for refueling because it would slow the plane down and they'd use more fuel. And so they agreed together to do a detour to the Reno Tahoe International Airport for refueling. At takeoff, with the rear exit door open and the air stair extended, and I looked that up, and that's a clamshell door with a built-in stairs, and it's in the back of this particular kind of airplane. Northwest resisted flying with this thing open, and he insisted. But then he relented and he said he could lower it himself in air. So they took off. He demanded that Tina stay to help because he needed help to open the stairs. They took off at 7:40. They were followed at a distance out of sight by 2 F-106 fighters from McChord Air Force Base and by a Lockheed trainer plane from the Air National Guard. These all stayed back out of view. They had to do an S flight because he was traveling so slowly and they were having trouble being slow enough. He told Tina to open the air stairs, and she was really afraid. She told him, "I'm afraid of getting sucked out." So he let her go, lock herself into the cockpit, and he would do it himself. She begged him, "Please, take the bomb with you." He said he could disarm it or take it, not to worry. So as she left, she saw him tie the money bag around his waist. They're all in the cockpit now. He's in the back. And at 8 o'clock, they said the cockpit light showed that the air stair had been deployed. It had been opened. The pilot asked on the intercom, "Do you need any help?" And Cooper yelled no. At 8:13, so 13 minutes later, the tail pitched up and the pilots had to work to level it. They said this happened near the northern suburbs of Portland. The crew wasn't sure. Was Cooper still on the plane? They used the intercom. They were approaching Reno, and they told him on the intercom to raise the stairs for the safety of the landing, and there was no reply. At 11:02, they landed in Reno with the stairs down. The perimeter was surrounded by FBI, local police, sheriffs, and state troopers. They feared the bomb was still on the plane. So the FBI bomb squad went on the plane before they did anything, before they even let the crew out, and searched the plane for 30 minutes, found no bomb. So they did collect some evidence. They had 66 fingerprints. They had a black clip-on tie and a clip that he left, a tie clip that he had left, and 2 of the parachutes, one of which had been cut up for the bag. The FBI developed eyewitness sketches. They're pretty famous. Local reporter was in a huge hurry to get the story out by deadline, and he accidentally called him DB instead of Dan. He didn't have time to check, and he published it as Dan Cooper, and the UPI, the national press, picked it up and it became his pseudonym. The police looked for previous crimes, previous criminals with the same alias, and they actually found one in Portland, but he had minor record, nothing big, and he was eliminated as a suspect. Because of the environmental conditions and all the variables that might have affected the search area, it made it really difficult to define where to look, and no one knew exactly where and when he pulled the cord, which would also affect where he landed. The fighters were so far back, they didn't see anything with their eyes, and nothing showed on the radar. There was no moon. There was a low cloud cover, and there were no ground lights where they were. On December 6th, the FBI used the Air Force Blackbird to retrace and to photograph the path. They made 5 flights, but the visibility was poor. They realized they weren't going to get a whole lot of information from that. The FBI then used the same plane that Northwest Airlines had used, and they pushed a 200-pound sled out of it, trying to recreate the upward movement of the tail. And they were able at that point to confirm this must have been when he jumped. The tail went up. That's what that was, him jumping out. And so they could locate a little bit better, extrapolate where he might have jumped. They checked the southern part of Mount St. Helens, southeast of Ariel, Washington, near Lake Merwin, which is an artificial lake created by a dam on the Lewis River. They searched all over Clark and Cowlitz counties, a large area of forests on foot and with helicopters. They went door to door to all the farmhouses in the area. They used patrol boats in Lake Merwin and Yale Lake Reservoir. The Oregon Army, National Guard, and the FBI did aerial searches of the flight path, which they named Vector 23, which was from Seattle to Reno. They saw some broken treetops, and they saw some pieces of plastic that was never, those pieces were never identified, but they saw no real evidence that was relevant to a hijacker landing with a parachute. After the spring thaw in 1972, the FBI and approximately 200 Fort Lewis soldiers and the U.S. Air Force, the National Guard, and civilian volunteers searched the area for 18 days in March and another 18 days in April. They also put a submarine in Lake Merwin. Local women, just out on a walk, found a skeleton in an abandoned building, but it proved to be the body of Barbara Ann Derry, a teenager who had very sadly been abducted and murdered weeks before. There was never any evidence of the hijacking that was found. According to this article that I read, I'm sure there's all kinds of conflicting stuff. Using very early computers, they guesstimated, I couldn't read my writing, they guesstimated that he jumped over La Center, Washington. In 2019, the FBI report was finally released. There had been a grocery store burgled 3 hours after Cooper jumped near a place called Hyson, Washington. The only thing taken out of the grocery store was survival stuff. But somehow somebody saw who did it, and the guy that did it had military boots on, and Cooper had been wearing slip-on brown fancy shoes, so they don't think it was him. 1 month later, the FBI released the number of the serial numbers to banks and casinos and financial institutions, hoping that they would find some of the ransom money. Northwest Airlines offered a 15% reward, which would have been $25,000. In early 1972, Attorney General Mitchell made the serial numbers public to everybody. 2 con men used counterfeit 20s with the serial numbers to extort $30,000 from Newsweek reporter in exchange for an interview with a fake hijacker. In 1973, the Oregon Journal newspaper offered a $1,000 reward for any of the money brought into them. The first person who brought in a bill that was genuine. And the Seattle Post-Intelligencer offered $5,000. And all of these offers were good until Thanksgiving Day of 1974. The insurance eventually paid the airline $180,000. So they lost some money in this, but still. And they had to first go to court and fight for it. It was ordered by the Minnesota Supreme Court eventually. It would have been equivalent to $1,020,000 today. They later determined that the first estimate that they made of his landing zone was inaccurate. They recalculated the jump area because of it. The first time they had the wind data wrong. Now they're thinking that he jumped over Washougal River watershed. In 1986, the FBI said that if they searched again, it would be in the Washougal watershed. And it has since then been searched and no evidence was found. And they speculate that maybe no evidence was found because the damage done by the explosion of Mount St. Helens. In July of 2016, the FBI suspended any active investigation because other cases just had priority. It's 2016. That took a long time. But they didn't close it. They suspended it. They said they would still accept possible evidence. The case included 66 volumes of stuff, and it's been kept at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. for historical purposes, and it's all open to the public. If you want to go look at the case of D.B. Cooper, you can go look at it. This was the only case of air piracy in the United States that was never solved. So what physical evidence do they have? They have the clip-on tie with the tie clip for pennies, and the actual tie was discontinued in 1968. By 2007, they were able to get a partial DNA profile from the tie, that they had found DNA in 2001, but it was just a little bit, and it took that long for them to make a profile. But it's no proof that this DNA belonged to Cooper. They don't know. It could have been anybody touching that tie or whatever. They had an airplane ticket with his name on it and had the composite sketches. In 2009, a citizen group called the Cooper Research Team formed, and I skipped over the names and their qualifications and everything. It's, they used new technology, GPS, satellites, and everything like that. They analyzed particles on the tie with an electron microscope. They found spores that were significant and alloys, and the alloys had a lot of titanium. The question that what they found microscopically, the question that they were able to ask was, did this guy work in the aerospace industry? He could have worked for Boeing or some aeronautical engineering company, because of the chemicals that they found, and the metal alloys would have had to have come from an aeronautical plant. Especially significant was the titanium, because in the 70s, it was only used in airplane manufacturing. The other particles suggested maybe he worked for some sort of Boeing contractor. They did have hair samples. They found 2 hairs on a seat, one from a limb and one from a head. And the FBI lab actually destroyed the hair from the limb on purpose, because they didn't think they could learn anything from it, but they preserved the hair from the head, and then they lost it. The local office, somebody got in big trouble there, I'm sure. They had cigarette butts, 8 Raleigh filter tip cigarette butts with absolutely no fingerprints on them. And they were kept in the Las Vegas FBI office. In 1998, the FBI tried to do DNA on the cigarette butts and found out they had been destroyed by the Las Vegas office. There was the money. They did find some of the money. On February 10th of 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was on a vacation with his family on the Columbia River, 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. And he was raking sand, a little kid fooling around, and he found 3 packs of ransom money, equivalent to $5,800. The bills were partially disintegrated. There's a description, of how disintegrated they were, but they were still in their intact bundles, and it was verified by the serial numbers that they were part of the ransom money. They were able to determine that they were not intentionally buried, that they were deposited by the movement of the river, and this supported the notion that he may have landed in the Washougal watershed because of how that river merges with the Columbia and the way the water moves. But a few of the $10 bills were missing, and they said, oh, look, how did these packets remain intact, but there are 3 tens missing, and how did the 3 packs stay together but separate from the rest? Who knows? Because the Army Corps of Engineers were dredging previous to this discovery, they were able to estimate when the bills might have been buried in the sand. Because of diatoms found in 2020 on the money, they were determined that the money went into the water months after the hijacking. The money was divided in 1986 between Ingram, the little boy, Northwest's insurance company, and the FBI. Ingram sold his money in 2008 for $37,000, or today it would have been worth $52,000. So this money was really the only physical evidence ever found outside the plane. They had the parachutes. Let's talk about the parachutes. One was a dummy parachute, which was not meant to be used. I think they gave it to him mistakenly because the fear was he was going to put it on crew members or put it on passengers, and they would not have taken the risk. So apparently they didn't know. And a dummy, it was missing the parachute on the inside. It was cut out, but they realized that this is the parachute that they use to train people how to put them on and stuff. It didn't really open. And because the internal part was missing, that he left behind, he had jumped with the bag, and they think that this was the one that he used to put the money in. In November of 1978, a hunter found instructions from a 727 on how to lower the air stair within the basic flight path near Castle Rock, Washington. So it's just some sort of cardboard, instruction set. And he found it just somewhere in the woods. So the theories that exist, they have sketches. And the first sketch they call the Bing Crosby sketch, because I guess it looked a little bit like Bing Crosby. It's called Composite A. But the witnesses, the flight crew said, and the other passengers said, no, that's not really an accurate drawing. So then they went back to the drawing board, literally, and made Composite B about a year later. And the witnesses said, this is closer, but he looks a little too angry or nasty, too much like a hoodlum. So then, they said Cooper looked more refined and younger than that sketch. So then the FBI refined it and came up with composite number 3, and witnesses said this is very close resemblance to what the guy really looked like. They did some profiling on him. The flight attendant, Schaffner, and Mucklow attendants gave nearly identical descriptions. They were separated from each other and interviewed actually in different cities by the FBI, and they gave very identical descriptions. Other passengers gave conflicting heights and talked about his skin tone and stuff, but the FBI came up with a basic profile in May of '73. They said he might have been a military-trained parachutist and not a sports skydiver. He had an athletic build and therefore probably exercised more than most people his age. Was he an Air Force veteran? Was he from the Seattle area, the Tacoma area? He seemed to know the area. His vocabulary, the way he planned, his use of aviation terminology, they think he was not a common criminal. He seemed intelligent, not impulsive, not easily rattled, very calm, able to go with the flow. He had a very careful procedure. He was a procedure-oriented planner. He was good at adapting to variables. He was meticulous, methodical. He worked independently. He didn't want and did not need an accomplice. He was probably, they thought, desperate for money. They said people who steal in this way, heists, who steal huge amounts of money, are usually desperate for money because of the risk involved. They need the money urgently. The crime would not be worth the considerable risk if they weren't desperate. They dismissed the probability that he was a thrill seeker, that he did it to prove it could be done. Once again, not worth the risks. He had spilled his first drink. They brought him a drink, bourbon and 7, and he spilled it, and they offered to give him another one, but he refused. He didn't ask for any more during the whole entire event, and so they think from that they extrapolate he's probably not an alcoholic. He probably didn't have problems with alcohol because this was a very high stress situation, and it's more likely, given what they know about psychology, that he might have preferred to have a little alcohol to relax if this was an issue for him. They calculated from the number of cigarettes he left over time that he probably smoked about a pack a day. They speculated that his alias, Dan Cooper, was from a fictional Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot and hero and main character of a French language Belgian comic book in which Dan Cooper skydives. They weren't sold in the U.S., and therefore the suspect had likely been in Europe and probably spoke French, but I wondered, could he have been in Canada? Or had he been in Canada? He planned carefully. He had a specific knowledge of aviation and the local terrain and the specific 727 plane. He chose the last row seat because he was able to observe and respond to any action in the cabin. He minimized the chances of being attacked from behind, and he was less conspicuous to the other passengers. He demanded 4 parachutes, as we said, to mislead. They would thought he would force others to jump with him, and therefore they could not sabotage the chutes. Having the threat of the bomb, thwarted attempts to rush him. That might not end well. He was careful not to leave evidence. He collected all the notes that he had given to people and put them in his pocket. He collected the empty matchbook that he had helped the stewardess light her cigarette. She was going to throw it away, and he took it and put it in his pocket. His big mistake is he forgot the tie. He seemed to know all about 727s. It's one of very, very few passenger jets from which a parachutist could jump easily. The attendants told the FBI that Cooper seemed very familiar with the 727, with the fueling procedures. He knew 727s could be flown slow and low without stalling. He knew that the flap setting that he wanted them to set allowed him to control the airspeed and the altitude without having to get into the cockpit. He seemed to know a secret that wasn't common knowledge, that was unique to 727s, that the aft, in the back, air stair, could be used in flight, and rear activation button switch existed in the back that could not be overridden from the cockpit. And the FBI speculated that he knew that the CIA had used this method to drop agents and supplies into Vietnam during flights. Civilian crews were rarely aware of this at all. He seemed familiar with parachutes and how to put them on and how to use them. So they asked, was this guy a military parachutist? Between 2006 and 2009, a team thought that maybe he was an Air Force aircraft cargo loader and might not have sufficient knowledge to survive a jump like a paratrooper would. So, about his fate. The FBI did not believe that he survived. They thought he had a lack of experience, a lack of proper equipment, the temperature and the weather were against him, the terrain was bad, he would not have had a knowledge of how to land, and the ransom money never got used. So, this no experienced parachutist would have risked jumping into a pitch black night in the rain with 172 mile-per-hour winds in loafers and a trench coat. But a skydiving instructor who supplied the chutes said that he disagreed with the FBI. He said he wouldn't have needed extensive experience to survive. He said anybody who had had 6 or 7 practice jumps could have accomplished this. But jumping at night greatly increased the risk of injury because he didn't have jump boots, some special kind of shoes. And without jump boots, you could have severe ankle and leg injuries on landing. He didn't have a helmet. He didn't have any protection against the extreme cold, and it was 15 degrees at 10,000 feet. He might have had boots and gloves and goggles in a paper bag that he had nobody ever saw, because by the time he was getting ready to jump, everybody was closed up in the cockpit. He had no accomplice on the ground. It didn't make sense. It would have required a precision landing to a certain extent. He had no specific flight plan. And then they altered the plan in midair to swing over to Reno for refueling. He had no way to communicate with anybody on the ground to let them know that. Also, there was very low cloud cover and no visibility, so that would have added to the difficulty. And then the ransom money wasn't spent. So they figure he probably never got his chute open. This is what the FBI said, that he got affected by the hypothermia in the air after he jumped, and he landed in the Columbia River and drowned. However, an anonymous senior FBI agent in 1976, that's pretty early, said to the Seattle Times, and this is a quote, "I think Cooper made it. I think he slept in his own bed that night. He could have just walked out right down the road after landing." He described that it was flat territory. Trees were a problem, but he says they weren't even looking for him there at that time. They thought he was somewhere else. There's no evidence of his death. Nothing's ever been found. After this event, 5 different copycats tried hijacking planes and jumping out of planes, and they survived. Forced the FBI to change their theories and their opinions. There's been a big debate in the past about the statute of limitations, and I won't go into all the legal arguments about it, but did he forfeit his legal immunity? And the feeling is probably, but in 1976, a Portland grand jury issued an indictment against him in absentia for air piracy and violation of the Hobbs Act. And I looked up the Hobbs Act. It prohibits robbery across borders, basically. Therefore, he could be prosecuted if he was found today. So there's a slew of suspects, and I'm just going to read a couple of them to give you a feeling for how difficult this must be. Between 71 and 2016, the FBI came up with more than 1,000 suspects. Some were publicity seekers, some made deathbed confessions. For example, a guy called Ted Braden, and this guy, oh my God, allegedly to me, sounded and looked just like a real true blue psychopath. He had been a Special Forces master skydiver in Vietnam and a convicted felon. He was one of the military's best skydivers. He deserted from the military while in Vietnam and became a mercenary in the Congo. He was arrested by the CIA. He was court-martialed, found guilty, and then given an honorable discharge because he had secrets they were afraid he would divulge, so they made a deal, allegedly. This is a quote, he was continuously involved in shady deals to make money. He drove a truck for a company in Vancouver, Washington, near the drop zone. He was investigated by the FBI for a $250,000 scam, which seems never to have been charged. He was indicted by a grand jury for driving an 18-wheeler full of stolen goods from Arizona to Massachusetts. That kind of disappeared. He was arrested in Pennsylvania in a stolen car with no driver's license and altered plates, switched plates. No news about that. Eventually, he ended up in federal prison in the late 80s, and the crime, nobody seems to know. He's a perfect combo, this is a quote, of high intelligence and criminality. So that's a big suspect. Another is Kenneth Peter Christensen. In 2003, his brother Lyle tried to convince the FBI, and then later Nora Ephron, make a movie, that his brother Kenneth was Cooper. There was a book about it, and then later an episode on the History Channel of some show, but the evidence they have, the evidence is just real circumstantial, although most evidence of crimes is circumstantial, but it was very tenuous. He was an Army paratrooper, but he was also a Northwest flight attendant. And it says that he resembled the sketches. And then a guy called Jack Coffelt, who was con man, who said he was Cooper and that he was in the area, and he did prove to be in the area, and he had a leg injury that he got right around that time. Fizzled out. Then a guy called Lynn Doyle Cooper. His ID was given to the FBI by his niece in 2011. When she was 8 years old, she heard 2 of her uncles planning something very mischievous, and the next day the hijacking occurred. They had been supposedly on a turkey hunt, and her uncle came home with blood all over him. She overheard her parents later discussing it and saying, oh, well, they think that he was involved in the hijacking. He was obsessed with the French Dan Cooper books. His DNA did not match the DNA on the tie. Then here's an interesting one. Barbara Dayton. She was a University of Washington librarian, Robert at birth, who had gender reassignment surgery in 1969, the first person in Washington state, apparently, to do that. And 2 years later claimed that she had hijacked the plane disguised as a man to get revenge on the airline industry because previously she had tried to become a pilot and they blocked her. She later recanted all of this, but the FBI at that point had, investigated like crazy. And then there's a whole long list of other people, and I didn't bother. I mean, okay, so there's a lot of suspects. This case has developed an enormous cult following. There are t-shirts, there are coffee mugs, there's CooperCon in late November every year, and it actually began in Ariel, Washington. That was close to where they think he landed, at the Ariel Store Pub. But when the owner of the pub died, the pub was forced to close. So they moved Cooper Days from Ariel to Seattle, and it's now called CooperCon, and it happens every November in honor of D.B. Cooper. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was struggling to figure out who to talk about this week. And when I opened the paper, I found this article, and it just jumped out at me, and I thought, oh, isn't this interesting? I'll do him. Why not? And it wasn't until I was deep into the research that I realized, oh my God, I have this planned for Wednesday. Wednesday is Thanksgiving Eve. He committed the crime on Thanksgiving Eve. I just thought that was such a coincidence. And as luck would have it, I got delayed yesterday, and I apologize for that. But still a good story. So let's very quickly summarize the details in this little tidbit. It's going to be eye-opening. The parachute used by the hijacker D.B. Cooper may have been found. Sunday marked the 53rd anniversary of the only unsolved hijacking in U.S. aviation history. Now, years after the FBI declared the case inactive, they're taking an informal look, examining evidence that has recently come to light. And all of this is reported to the New York Daily News from the Cowboy State Daily in Wyoming. What evidence? The evidence is a parachute found in an outbuilding on the family property of Richard McCoy II, whose children have long suspected their father was Cooper. The unassuming-looking man who had come to be known as D.B. Cooper bought a one-way ticket on Northwest Airlines from Portland to Seattle on November 24th of 71. And we won't go over the crime again. We know what happened. He leaped out of the back of the plane, and eventually 3 bundles of cash were found, and the clues yielded no identification, and finally the case became inactive in 2016. McCoy, who is known to have pulled off an almost identical heist 5 months later over Utah, has long been on the FBI's shortlist. He was arrested for that, he broke out of jail, and was eventually killed in a police shootout. The mystery has tantalized many over the years, spawning books, documentaries, and the conference, CooperCon. Dan Greider, an aviation-obsessed YouTuber who's a retired pilot and skydiver, has been documenting his search on YouTube. McCoy's grown children, Shantae and Rick McCoy III, reached out to Greider after the death of their mother in 2020. They had held back before. They found this parachute a while back because they suspected she was complicit. The FBI did not immediately answer inquiries, and there is a picture of one of the similar backpacks that he left on the plane after he jumped out, and I will hold that up for you. You can see. So that's the story and the mystery of D.B. Cooper. And the suspects continue. The plot thickens again. It re-thickens. I hope you enjoyed that little distraction. Thank you very much for watching. I will be doing a little bit of a deeper dive in my usual way into this on my Substack behind the paywall. And the name of my Substack is Ask Your Irish Granny. Sorry to have to do that, but it's the way of the world these days. So check out my conversation with Marina that we talked yesterday. I uploaded it this morning. Check out my conversation with Gerald. We talked yesterday, and I uploaded it last night. Just some pleasant conversations just to distract and to entertain. And stay tuned because I have some more interesting people coming along up my sleeve, and we will be continuing our coverage of the Marilyn book this weekend. I've got a lot of interest in that book and a lot of positive feedback. Let me know if this is the kind of book you would like me to continue to pursue. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your Thanksgiving weekend. Put on your headphones and go for a walk. Get away from the guests and get away from doing the dishes. And listen to one of my videos. And in the meantime, slán go fóill, slánte.